Hello, I'm on the edge of insanity. Also, I filmed the wrong way last time because I kind of covered the speakers the entire time. As it is, I can't hear much on this, so I kind of like screwed myself over there. But okay, today we're going to be getting into Mao Zedong. You're going to see some of my awful pronunciation. Okay, let's get into it. It's going to be fun. Okay, this is my map, by the way, guys. Yeah, I'm gonna, okay. Among five other things, I must know this. Okay, let's get into it. Mao Zedong, well, I'm not going to talk about, obviously, when he was born, but he was in power from 1949 up until his death in 1976. Let's get into it, baby. We should probably talk about some of the conditions prior to Mao's rule. I'm going to be super speedy zoomy, so try and keep up with me. Okay, Mao Zedong. So some of the conditions prior to his rule, and I'm going to be talking about like really prior, like 30 years prior, so stay with me. So you have the Jing dynasty, which is overthrown by Sun Yat-sen in 1911, who believes that, they needed to have a Chinese revolution, that they needed to be independent. I do not remember who it was inspired by, but, he obviously saw inspiration globally, and he was like, yes, we need to, the Japanese, yeah, so he was like, yeah, we need to overthrow the Jing dynasty, and we need to, get it together. So he leads the Chinese Revolution in 1911, however, he is sort of, like, MacGyvered out of it. Is that the right use of that term? I don't know. Should I look it up? No. By Yuan Shikai, who kind of sucked, and he set the entire movement back, like, before he made it so that it never happened. Anyways, so Japan issued the 21 demands to Yuan Shikai, which he agreed to, which basically meant that they loaned out some parts of China to Japan. Stupid move. Anyways, then they had the May 4th movement after World War I in 1919, where basically they had been denied rights to some of the colonies after World War I, and they were upset about that. That's what that was. Anyways, let's get into the good stuff. So what are the roots of Mao? Where does he come from? Well, Mao, quite early on in life, had a keen interest in Marxism. He was one of the founding members of the Chinese Communist Party, and he actually helped barter the Kuomintang and Chinese Communist Party alliance, which, did not last long, with their alliance breaking apart, leading to guerrilla warfare in the Autumn Harvest Rising. I do not have a date for this. In the Autumn Harvest Rising, they utilized guerrilla warfare, but it wasn't going too well, so Mao made the call to have them retreat to Jiangxi, which is spelled Jiangxi, but it can also be spelled Shangxi, which is Shaanxi, but I prefer the one with the J. Anyways, so they retreat to Jiangxi, and Mao kind of sets up a Soviet there, like the Chinese Soviet, so he trains and disciplines people, and that happens between 1927 and I think the Autumn Harvest Rising was 1928. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was it. Anyways, so they're in Jiangxi from 1927 to 34, and this saw to the Fuxian incident, F-U-T-I-A-N incident, where, I'm sorry, I'm excited about this, I just like remembering things, the Fuxian incident, which is where Mao tortured 4,000 soldiers for information in 1932. No, in 1930. If I'd gotten that date right, bro. Anyways, so he basically built up his Chinese Soviet and his ideology here. Then you have the Long March in 1934 up until 1935, so it lasts for a year. The Long March was by far the most important moment in Mao's rise to power, because that kind of like catapulted him into his reputation of being this great military leader, this strategist who like knew how to plan Why is that? So basically, he leads this entire army to safety over this year-long trek to um, the to Yanan, which is where they set up like this communist haven, communist society in a cave system, and they stay there from 1935 to 45, so 10 long years that he spends building up that Soviet. What does he do there? Let's talk about it. So obviously you have things like they had like a university where he would go in and lecture, there was a lot of Marxist theory, so on and so forth, and this is where he developed his ideas of what would enable him to take over the country. Let's begin. So in Yanan was where he developed this idea of a peasant policy, which put him in a great position and increased his popularity. What basically was it? So he ordained to his army that the reason people were so opposed to people ruling over, the peasants were so opposed to people ruling over them was because they were treated so awfully. So he said, you are going to treat them amazingly. You are going to take land from landowners and give it back to the peasants, and that's going to be liberated land. You are going to give them proper medical attention because there wasn't great health care. You are going to help, increase literacy. You're going to create peasant associations, of course, with a CCP member to veto things. But local government, you're going to also stop charging exorbitant rates of interest. So already they were winning the favors of the public. Now let's get into Mao in the Communist Party. Let's go internally for a second. So Mao interpreted communist theory. Oh my God, that is some awful writing. Mao interpreted communist theory to suit China, which he then labeled Maoism, or which was labeled Maoism. He believed that although China didn't have a proletariat, they could still become a communist country because instead of the proletariat, they would just use the peasant population, seeing as to how 80% of China was peasants and only 4% was workers. So the peasants, this is a good quote by Mao, who said that the peasants are the sea and we are the fish, we are in the sea. So, within the Communist Party, Mao saw a lot of opposition, especially in the Comintern and this organization called the 28 Bolsheviks in China, where they, tend to criticize him for like straying from communist theory. They saw it as like blasphemy against communism, which is a bit ironic and paradoxical if you think about it. But anyway, Mao succeeds and manages to shut them down because of his success with the Long March. Told you it was influential, and also because of his background and field research on peasant matters. So whenever there was a CCP meeting, he was able to dominate any discussion because he knew so much about it. He was also a great military planner, so that aided in his reputation. Okay, perfect. Let's talk about the Japanese occupation from 1937 to 45. Yanan was 1935 to 45. Okay, 1937 to 45. Mao united the CCP and the Kuomintang. Basically, the CCP and the Kuomintang get together to kick Japan out of China. And all that does is it diverts the Kuomintang from the Communist Party. The nationalists actually do a bulk of the fighting, but the CCP take credit for it. Mao ideally says that, the Communist Party, we are just standing for the nation. We just want to get these Japanese colonizers out of our country, and that appeals to anyone with a hint of nationalist pride in them, so it works wonders for their popularity. And then, bingo bango, you got the Chinese Civil War from 1945 to 49 with I realize that I've been doing that and it's sort of screeching, isn't it? Okay, I'm sorry. Then you have the Chinese Civil War from 1945 to 49 with a death toll of 6 million people. What happens in it? Basically, in the end, Chiang Kai-shek, who was the head of the Kuomintang, his name can be spelled Jiang or Qiang, but Jiang, flees to Taiwan, formerly Formosa. That's tongue twister. Okay, so why is it that the nationalists lose? So the nationalists, they have a lack of rank and file soldiers, right? Yeah, they also have low morale, poor planning, they don't have a lot of support, and they fail to use aid that they receive from the USA. The communists win because they have Mao, who has a mix of determination and opportunism, who is a great military planner, and their army is able to live off the land, the peasants support them, and they have the power of command, they have a good line of command, and they also managed to resist Stalin's partition efforts. So, yeah. And then, on the 1st of October, 1949, they officially found the People's Republic of China. So, victory secured. But how long will it be secured, is the question. Excuse me, I don't know why I'm British all of a sudden. No offense to any British people that might be watching this. Call me. Anyways. You could colonize me. No, Cultural Revolution. Did we talk about that, or should we do... We shouldn't have said that. Okay. Why am I... So, Mao introduces the Rectification of Conduct campaign in 1942, which goes on until 1944, which sees to the idea of democratic centralism, and it basically is just to get rid of opposition. And he crowns himself the chairman of the CCP. How wonderful! He basically asked for a loyalist to the Maoist ideology, and he was referred to as the Great Helmsman. Wonderful. He also achieves cult status in Yanan by that point, and he has 1,000 people imprisoned. Ooh, my charge is running low. Okay. This is so, like, split up. Okay. So that was the Rectification of Conduct campaign. Again, I'm sorry about screeching. Let's talk about the reunification campaigns, which happened in 1950, where basically the Communist Party dispatches PLA, People's Liberation armies into Xinjiang, Tibet, and southern Guangdong. Yeah, Xinjiang, Tibet, southern Guangdong, to reunify the place, to consolidate the regime. Then you had the anti-movements, also in 1950, I believe, in the 1950s. Yeah, there's not much about that. Okay, then we have the anti-landlord campaigns, where, like, it's basically, the anti-movements was kind of like dekulakization. So suspicious people had these dossiers on them known as dangangs. Anyways, then you have the anti-landlord campaign, which, why do I feel like I've got like a spot there? Okay, the anti-landlord campaigns, which had land being taken from the landlords, and you had public trials of these landlords, with it later coming out that about 1 million of them were killed in the 1950s. So that's a bit wild. Alright. Yeah, I didn't discuss this before, but the structure of the PRC was basically so that you had these 4 positions of command. You had the military commander, the chairman, the political commissar, and the party secretary. Mao held 2 of these 4 positions, and the other 2 were held by People's Liberation Army members, so he was pretty much top dog. I'll never say that again. Then you have the 100 Flowers campaign in 1957, where basically, we need some context for this. So at the time, you had Brezhnev, I believe. Yeah, Brezhnev, who comes into power and he's like all about peaceful coexistence and like giving the people liberties and a voice and stuff like that. Or actually, I think it might have been Khrushchev. Yeah, I think Khrushchev. So Mao sees this and he's like, it's key to remember that Mao was heavily influenced by, Stalinist Russia, by communism in Russia. So he sees this and he's like, he sees it was Khrushchev, because he sees de-Stalinization going on, and he sort of goes like, oh my god, that's gonna happen to me later. I need to like make sure that they don't do that. So he's like, oh, maybe communism is taking a turn for the more liberal. So he's like, hey guys, you can come in and you can basically gossip about me to my face, and I'm just gonna sit there and take it. Which should give you an indicator that he did not sit there and take it. So he does that. He invites people to criticize, the Communist Party. It was called 100 Flowers campaign because it was like, let 100 flowers bloom like 100 schools of thought or something like that. So he does this, and then he basically executes anybody that spoke against him. So there's a lot of historical debate about whether it was deliberate or genuine. I personally believe in the idea that it was a deliberate move by Mao because it helped him identify his critics and have them removed. So, yeah, I believe it was. You could argue it wasn't, agree to disagree. Yeah. Anyways, let's talk about, I love this. Let's talk about economic reforms. You're gonna love it too. So you had initially a failed 5-year plan in 1952, which was abandoned for, hold your applause, the Great Leap Forward from 1958 to 62, which, contradictory to its name, was maybe a great leap into the pit of hell. Okay, so the aim of the Great Leap Forward, as Mao describes it, was that peasants would create surplus grain, produce surplus grain, which would then be sold abroad, and they would help industrialize by mass producing steel at home. Let that sink in. Oh, sink. No, I'm kidding. Man, I wish I had the patience to edit this and I would so add that meme, but anyways, you know what I'm talking about. Right, so this leads to a policy of mass collectivization, where Mao sets up 70,000 communes with 500 million peasants living in them, and basically forces them to collectivize, and that leads to a death toll of, hold it, 9 million in Sichuan, 7.8 million in Henan, and 1 million in Tibet. You know what, give me 1 second, I'm just going to plug in my charger, because otherwise it's going to die, and this is going to have been for nothing, so, hold. That was so dramatic for no reason. Anyways, right, so 9 million Sichuan, 7.8 million Henan, and 1 million Tibet. So that was some of the death tolls recorded due to the collectivization program, and obviously that led to a famine. Let's talk about the steel again. Let's circle back to that ingenious idea of producing industrial material in your backyard. They would just grab anything that's steel, melt it, and be like, here's steel. So, not great for quality. And one of my favorite quotes, I believe it's the person that wrote this textbook, but I think it's historian Lee, argues that goodwill alone cannot produce good steel. And you know what? He got that right. So now you have this state of virtual, how do I say this, chaos, and who's left to fix it? Well, Mao decides, you know what? I had a good run. I'm just gonna go vacation in the Caribbean. Not really, but maybe mentally. And he says, you know what? I'm gonna leave some people to fix this. And he leaves these two guys, Deng and Liu, to deal with the repercussions. And he just kind of withdraws from the public eye. So, yeah. Anyways, now it's sort of like, when Queen Bee does the comeback stage. When yeah, anyways. So, when is the great big Mao Zedong comeback? Let's get into that. The great Mao Zedong comeback was the Cultural Revolution, which lasted from 1966 to 76 and produced some of maybe the most horrifying educational films ever. And by that I mean literal people in education being tortured. Why is that? Let's get into it. So, let's set the stage for this. What was the Cultural Revolution? Well, obviously, as the name suggests, it was Mao deciding that China needed a new culture. With, guess what at the center? That's right, Mao. What were his motives for his little comeback stage, his little debut? First of all, he was growing old. So at the time, I believe he was 72. And, obviously he could feel his mortality. And in a publicity stunt, as I would call it, he actually swam across the Yangtze River in 1976 to say, hey, I'm still young. Although it was propaganda and he didn't really swim, apparently. So, also, I should add this in. He had a school for the hearing where he was said to cure deafness. So obviously there was a lot of propaganda and glorification around him. You compare it to, the whole Stalinist zeal. But anyways, let's go back to the motives, right? So you also had paranoia at that point. He was greatly paranoid that after his passing, the revolution would stop. He also had resentment for Deng and Liu because they were credited for, having fixed what he messed up. And, obviously his sense of nationalism, China should be the best, China should so and so and so. That leads him to start the Cultural Revolution. Last 10 years, starting in 1966. He launches his little red book, right? He launches the little red book, which has 750 million copies sold in the first 4 years of its publishing. They were basically sayings of our great leader Mao Zedong, and everybody had to have one. If you didn't have one, you were pretty much flogged in the streets publicly. So kids would carry it in their lunchboxes, men would carry it around, women would carry it in their purses. It was everywhere. If you didn't have it, you were on the wrong side of history, my friend. At that time, anyways. Right, so what was the Cultural Revolution founded on? What was their ideology? So basically, Mao calls on all the young people in China to Tiananmen Square on 18th August 1966, and he says, guys, help us destroy revisionism, which was the four olds: old culture, old habits, old thoughts, and old customs. Culture, habits, thoughts, customs. Right. So all the youth are invigorated by this idea that, oh, we get to be in power. It is no longer like a gerontocracy or whatever you call it. So the youth enlist in this wave of nationalism as Red Guards, and they would often do things like wage civil wars against each other and kill people. The Liu was tormented to death. It was actually really sad because they captured him and they tortured him and they didn't give him the drugs that he needed for his diabetes, so he literally suffered. It was really disturbing to read. I did not like that. really sorry. I hope he's in a better place. And Deng, he was sent to do corrective labor. He tried to escape, but then he was caught and sent to, a labor camp. Yeah, and then you had the Gang of Four under Mao's wife Jiang Qing, who pretty much just wreaked havoc. And then at some point, this revolutionary zeal starts to get on people's nerves, even Mao's, because at that point they weren't actually doing him any favors, they were just being a nuisance. So he came up with the idea of the Up to the Mountains and Down to the Villages campaign, where he wanted the youth to get an idea of what it was like to work in the villages and know what they represent. So he carts off all these young people to these farms for hard, intensive labor. And what do you know? The sheltered teens of today realize that, hey, I don't like working. I kind of just like beating the shit out of people and being a menace to society. So they pretty much tired themselves out and they're like, yeah, you know what, I'm just gonna leave. Wonderful for them. Not so much for the farmers who might have needed the labor. You also have the setting up the Lao Gai, which were labor camps with 1,000 existing in 1976, and they had about 10 million prisoners each year. That's a lot. Yeah, so that was, a little bit about the Cultural Revolution. Let's get into the last bit, the domestic culture at the time. I'm surprised I didn't talk about foreign policy. But if we're talking about foreign policy, you have Sino-Soviet relations with the Treaty of Friendship in the 1950s and the Sino-Soviet split due to Khrushchev's actions in siding with the West, I believe. Right. Okay, domestic culture. Most of domestic culture was orchestrated, I don't know why I said it like that, orchestrated by Jiang Qing. If you remember, Mao's wife, who I mentioned 2 minutes ago. If you do not remember that, maybe you have the memory of a goldfish. I'm sorry, I don't mean that. You seem nice. Okay, so you had her, Jiang Qing, reforming all of the arts with awful drivel, pretty much. And this is a cool quote that I like, which basically it talks about how culture was paralyzed. It says that Yanan says that as a result of the Cultural Revolution, you could say that the cultural trademark of my generation is that we have no culture. So, okay, and then if we were to talk about religion, you have these patriotic sham churches. Sham is not in the title, I just do that to help me remember. But you have these patriotic churches which were sham. Basically, they just indoctrinate Maoist ideas into people. What? Even careful Anison was jeered at? What? Oh, so Confucian theory was rejected. That was not spelt well. I apologize. Confucian theory was rejected by Mao. As a result, women had more freedom. Let's talk about that, because that's kind of a good part of this. You have the marriage law in 1950, which outlaws concubinage, and it gives women the freedom to divorce and marry. Also, Mao abolishes feet binding, so that was great for women. Interestingly enough, communes, if you remember from the Great Leap Forward, meant that there were equal efforts, because this idea of a nuclear family was destroyed, because you had men and you had women living in communes. You'd have like conjugal visits, but I mean, yes, that was a bad thing because women were kind of stripped from their environment, but they didn't have to like worry about cooking and like bringing food in and stuff like that. Everybody pitched in. So, equality. Not equity, but equality. So the women in Chinese workforce increased from 8% to 32% between 1949 and 1976. And it is interesting, however, to note that only 13% of the Chinese Communist Party were women. So they didn't exactly love the women, but they were there as the minority. Not bad, though. And that's been Mao. I hope that was not too bad. I hope some of my jokes landed. I wish I hadn't made those jokes. I'm sorry. I hope this helped. So